going to talk about the central nervous system. And to begin with, we need to talk about how it's organized. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. And we can take the brain and we can divide it up into 4 different regions. So we have the cerebral hemispheres, we have the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. And we're going to talk about each one of those regions of the brain separately. If we look at the way tissue is organized in the central nervous system, we see that it's organized into gray matter and white matter. And so what I can do, I have a brain here that I've pulled up from the anatomage table. This is our high resolution brain. And I'm going to do a frontal plane cut. And I'm going to turn it so I can see it on the inside. So my image looks very similar to the image shown here. So we can see the outermost edge of the tissue here is a little bit darker in color, and we call this gray matter. And typically what we find in gray matter are short, non-myelinated neurons and also the cell bodies of neurons. So as you'll find out in just a minute, this outer crust of the brain consists of neuron cell bodies, and that's why it's gray matter. Now on the inside, we see tissue that's a little lighter in color, and we call this white matter. And this is primarily myelinated axons that are traveling in tracks of fibers that are bundled together. And the myelin that insulates the axons is lighter in color, and so it creates white matter on the inside of the brain here. Now, if you look at the cerebral hemisphere, which is going to be the first region of the brain that we're going to talk about, we can see that it's arranged in this convoluted structure of tissue. So we have areas that are raised areas of tissue, and then we have other areas that are grooves within the tissue. So if we look at the cerebral hemispheres, this is going to be the first region of the brain that we're going to talk about. This is going to be the area that a lot of us think of as our brain. These are our cerebral hemispheres, and we have 2 of them. So we have a left and a right. Okay. Now, if you look at the way this tissue is arranged, you'll see that it has raised areas of tissue and then indented areas in between them. The grooves in the tissue are called sulci. Okay. And we have a couple sulci that are special and have names: the lateral sulcus and the central sulcus. So if you look here on our image, this is a right lateral view, and we can see this area right here, this indented area here, is called the lateral sulcus. So I can actually there's my lateral sulcus. Now my central sulcus is going to be located between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So what I can do is draw a line here . Indicating my central sulcus. Okay. Now, on either side of the sulcus, we have raised areas of tissue. So here we have gyri, and we have specific areas that are named. We have a precentral gyrus and a postcentral gyrus. So the precentral gyrus, based on its name, is going to be the raised area of tissue just in front of the central sulcus. So if we look here, we're going to see that we have a raised area of tissue here that basically travels all the way down just in front of that central sulcus. Okay. this is going to be my precentral gyrus. Okay, and then we have a postcentral gyrus, which is going to be the raised area of tissue right behind the central sulcus. So if you look just behind the central sulcus, you're going to see this area of tissue here, raised area of tissue right behind it, and that's going to be my postcentral gyrus. Right behind it. So some important landmarks there. Now, we have some other landmarks that are going to be deep sulci, and we call these fissures. And so these are a little bit deeper than the sulci, like the lateral sulcus and the central sulcus. We've got two of these. One is the longitudinal fissure, and that's going to separate the left and right cerebral hemispheres. So if we clear that out, and I'm going to rotate our brain and even look at it from the top, we can indicate the longitudinal fissure here. Okay, this deep groove that separates our left from our right hemispheres. Okay, now the second one is going to be the transverse cerebral fissure, and this is located posteriorly, and it's going to separate the cerebrum or cerebral hemispheres from the cerebellum, which is the structure right here. So again, I can indicate in this area here, this is the location of our transverse cerebral fissure. It's more posterior. Okay, and you have this on the image here. Now, the cerebral hemispheres we can divide into lobes. So if we take a look at our image here, we've got our frontal lobe, which is going to be indicated more anteriorly, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to flat color that there. We have the parietal lobe, which is going to be just posterior to the frontal lobe, and I'll come in and flat color that as well. We have the temporal lobe, which is going to be on the side. Good. And we have the occipital lobe, which is going to be more posterior in the back of the brain. So here are the lobes indicated on the right side of the brain, and we would have the same lobes on the left side as well. Now, there is a fifth lobe, and if you peel back this lateral sulcus and you look just deep to that, you're going to see the insula. And that's going to be the fifth lobe of the brain that's located just deep. So we're going to talk about structures that are included in the first region of the brain, and these are going to be the cerebral hemispheres. We've got two of them like we talked about before. You've got a left and a right. The cerebral hemispheres can also be referred to as the cerebrum, so you'll also see that term as well. And when we think about the cerebral hemispheres, we can divide them into the cerebral cortex, which the cortex is going to be kind of the outer crust of the brain. So if you look at the brain kind of in frontal plane view, like we saw before, it's going to be that outer, 2 to 4 millimeters of tissue. And so this is going to be the cerebral cortex along the outside, and then on the inside is going to be the white matter. And as we've found out before, the white matter is going to be mainly consisting of myelinated axons and tracts of fibers. So this is where the cell bodies are going to be located, out here in the cerebral cortex. And then their axons are going to be traveling through the white matter on their way to, other structures. So in terms of the cerebral cortex, this is the area of our conscious mind. This is our awareness of ourselves, how we communicate, memories, voluntary movements. This is the outer 3 millimeters worth of crust of the brain. Anytime you see cortex, you'll see that in a few different organs that we talk about. Cortex always means like the outer crust of that organ. It is composed of billions of neurons arranged in 6 layers, and all neurons that you see in the cerebral cortex are considered to be interneurons, meaning that they basically connect one neuron to another, acting as an interneuron. So in this case, this neuron here would be the interneuron connecting these 2 neurons. Okay, so most of these form connections with other neurons. In terms of the cerebral cortex, we can divide it up in 3 kinds of functional areas. So we're going to have motor areas that basically manipulate movement of the body. We're going to have sensory areas that help us to process sensory information that's coming in. And then we have what's called association areas. And this is basically going to be kind of a combination of sensory and motor. So we're going to see both there. It's important to know that each hemisphere of the brain controls the contralateral half of the body. So contralateral means opposite. Okay, so what we see here is that, okay, so here's my brain again. I'm going to draw it in frontal plane view again. Okay, so here's my brain. Let's say we're looking at this person from the front and they're in anatomical position. So this is going to be the left side of this person. This is going to be the right side of this person. If we had a neuron, let's say we have a motor neuron that's coming from the left side of the brain. It's originating there. It's going to travel down. It's going to cross over, and then it's going to control motor function on the right side of the body. Okay, and that's what we mean by contralateral control. So this is the arrangement for both sensory and motor function of the with the connection between the brain and the body. So right side of the brain is going to control the left side of the body. So maybe we could have another one coming down this side. So originating in the right side of the body, it's going to come down, it's going to cross midline, and it's going to come down, and it's going to control motor or relay sensory information to the right side of the brain. So left side of body connecting to the right side of the brain. Okay, we do have what's called lateralization of cortical functions, meaning that the structures on each half of the hemispheres are symmetrical, but they actually don't function the same. So we have lateralization. Some things happen on the left side, some things happen on the right side. They tend to be a little bit different. And the entire cortex is involved. So conscious behavior involves the entire cortex, and you'll see that as we walk through our different types of functional areas. So we're going to talk about motor areas first. So motor areas of the cerebral cortex. One of the most important motor areas is the primary motor cortex. Okay, and this is located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. So if you remember, we had kind of our cross section of the brain, and we had our central sulcus, right? And then we had the area just in front of that raised area of tissue was our precentral gyrus. Now, that specific area is very important because it serves as our primary motor cortex, okay? primary motor cortex. And this is basically where we have conscious control of skeletal muscles. So when you tell your muscles to move, this is where it comes from. That signal is originating here. And what's happening is now it's originating here. Cell bodies located in the crust, or that outer cortex of the cerebral hemisphere. And then notice what's happening. This is the right side of the brain. It's going to travel all the way down through the spinal cord. It crosses over, travels down to the level that it needs to exit, and then it's going to innervate skeletal muscle on the opposite side of the body. So here we are on the left side of the body. So here's our contralateral arrangement between brain and body. So left primary motor cortex controls movements on the right side of the body. And basically what we have are long axons from these neurons traveling through tracts, which is basically going to be bundles of neurons. And these form nerves, and you already know these. These actually create those somatic motor nerves that we talked about before when we talked about skeletal muscle. The primary motor cortex is mapped out by what's called the motor homunculus, which is this crazy picture right here that basically just shows how the body is actually mapped out onto the brain. Okay. Now, another interesting motor area is the premotor cortex. So premotor cortex is actually going to be located just anterior to the primary motor cortex. So if you look at our brain again, we've got central sulcus, we've got just in front of that precentral gyrus with our primary motor cortex. Now, just in front of that, we're going to have another area here, which is going to be our premotor cortex. Okay, this is going to be frontal lobe, and that's going to be higher level cognitive functions. And so basically this is going to be helping us plan movements. This is going to be the task of combining basic movements into complex tasks, basically like playing the piano or even playing a sport like soccer. This is skilled motor activities that you do where initially you learned piece by piece, and then as you became more competent, it basically all just flows together because of this premotor cortex. I also want to point out too, what happens if you have a stroke that affects the right motor cortex? Okay? Let's say you see a patient who has a stroke that affects that particular area of their brain. So if their stroke was on the right premotor cortex, they would end up with left hemiparesis or even hemiplegia, depending on the type of symptoms that they had. The main point here is that we have a contralateral relationship between these two. So right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And if it affects the motor cortex, then that patient would have difficulty moving or generating movement patterns because of it. Now, also in our motor area, we have what's called a motor speech area. And this is Broca's area. And so this is going to be located here. It's indicated in purple. Oops. Indicated in purple in the brain. And so it's more frontal lobe function. And this is the motor speech area. So this is the area that controls the muscles that are active in producing speech. Also, it's active in preparing for speech. So this is the actual producing speech, the motor function of speech production. If you have a patient who had a stroke and this area was affected, they could end up having Broca's aphasia. And aphasia is just difficulty with speech. And I give you a link here to a patient example of a young patient who had a stroke with resultant Broca's aphasia. I would encourage you to watch that because it is really interesting. These patients really have a hard time getting words out. So they know what they want to say. They know what they want to say. They just can't get it out. Okay, so they have a very halting speech pattern. Now, let's talk a little bit about sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So if we were to compare the two, motor function is basically going to be arising from our primary motor cortex or our premotor cortex. Those neurons are going to travel down the spinal cord and out, and they're going to innervate skeletal muscles. So motor is going to be traveling this way, right, from the brain down to skeletal muscles. Sensory information is going to be doing exactly the opposite. So here's my brain, here's my sensory receptor maybe in my skin on my arm. Well, now we're going to be traveling this way. We're going to travel up to the brain. So we're going this way from the body up to the brain, and this is our sensory part. Okay? Primary somatosensory cortex, and soma means body, so this is going to be sensation of the body, is located in the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe of the brain. So if you look here on their drawing, here's my central sulcus. Now the gyrus that's just posterior to that is going to be my post-central gyrus. Post-central, so it's behind that central sulcus. So it's indicated here in blue. This is the location of the primary somatosensory cortex. And it's going to receive sensory information from the contralateral side of the body. So left side of the body is going to relay sensory information to the right primary somatosensory cortex. Okay? Basically, it's going to receive input from skin receptors, and then we also have some proprioceptive receptors in joints and muscles and that sort of thing to talk about our awareness of where we are in space. We have the same setup here. We have a sensory homunculus that basically maps out the way the body is indicated on the brain. And it's really basically upside down. It's like your body's kind of hanging down the side of your brain. But that's what the sensory homunculus does. We also have a somatosensory association area. And this is located just posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. And so this is going to be in this area. And so this is going to be parietal lobe. And this is basically, anytime we have an association area, this is going to be more of an integration type of function. So it's taking current information and it's comparing it to memory or prior information that you have stored to create an awareness or a decision about the information that's coming in. So I give you the example here where you are feeling around in your backpack and you're looking for a pencil and you get your hands on a pencil. Well, you can determine that that's a pencil without even looking at it because you have an understanding, a prior understanding of what pencils feel like, and you have a memory of that. And so you're able to compare your current sensory information to that prior memory and say, yes, what I've got is a pencil. Okay, and that's what association cortex, that's their function. Okay. We also have a primary visual cortex. Okay, and so sensory information from the eyes is going to be relayed posteriorly. Here's our visual cortex here, and so this is going to be occipital lobe. So we've got primary visual cortex that's back in the occipital lobe. We also have a visual association area. So again, this is association area. This is using memories of past visual input to integrate our current visual input into. Okay, so again, that's kind of a special use of an association area. Visual association area is also located in the occipital lobe. We have the auditory area. So auditory means hearing. So auditory area is going to be located in the temporal lobe. And so you can see that through here. Auditory cortex is going to receive hearing information from the inner ear. We also have an auditory association area, and just as before, we know that we are going to compare current sounds to past memories of other sounds that we've heard before and use them as a reference. So again, we have that integration component. We also have the olfactory area, and olfactory means smell. This is our sense of smell. And so this is also going to be in our temporal lobe, and this is our awareness of odors or smells. And so we're going to have olfactory receptors in the nose that convey that information to the temporal lobe, to our olfactory cortex. We have the gustatory cortex, and this is basically taste. Okay, this is taste information. And so we see gustatory cortex is located deep in the insula. So this is in that deep lobe that's deep to the temporal lobe. We have to peel that back at the lateral sulcus, and this is where taste information is going to travel to. We also have in the insula the visceral sensory area. So visceral means organ. Okay, and so this means the visceral sensory area is basically our perception of visceral sensations. So this is going to be like the sensation that you have when you're holding your breath for a long period of time, maybe if you're swimming. This is a sensation of maybe your lungs burning, breathing really cold air in, and you're doing hill repeats. This is a sensation of maybe your stomach hurting. So all of these visceral sensations would be perceived in that visceral sensory area. Okay. We also have a sensory area of speech. Okay, so this is sensory speech, and we call this Wernicke's area. So this is going to be this area here. This is posterior to Broca's area. So this is Wernicke's area. This is more temporal lobe. Okay, which is what we see here. And basically, this is the understanding of language. This is definitely more comprehension of language. This is not motor function. So motor is going to be Broca's. Okay, comprehension of language is going to be Wernicke's. So just like in our other scenario, we could have a patient who had a stroke who affected that affected Wernicke's area. And so this patient would present with Wernicke's aphasia, and basically we describe these patients as having word salad. So they can have lots of words coming out, but they really don't make sense. So that is typically what we see. Here. Lots of words, but they don't make sense because they're going to have a lack of comprehension. I give you a link again to a patient scenario on YouTube. I would highly encourage you to take a look at that because it's interesting to see the patient there with Wernicke's aphasia and how that presents. So just an overview of these structures. And then, like we talked about before, we do have these association areas. And these are multimodal. And what we mean by that is that basically they take both motor and sensory function and they combine it into one. And so this is now going to be a multimodal association area, receiving input from multiple senses and sending signals to multiple areas too. So as we've seen before with the association areas that we have talked about, this works with our memory. It allows us to give meaning to the information we receive or integrate it into our current memory. We're able to connect new information with previous experience and knowledge, and then based on that, decide what action or what outcome we want to take. Okay. There's an anterior association area, and this is located in the prefrontal cortex. So we know that frontal lobe is going to be most of our higher level cognitive function, and that's exactly what we see here. We see complex learning. This is the location of your personality, judgment, reasoning. These are typically very complicated tasks, and one of the things we see is that it is poorly developed in children. In fact, they a lot of times now say that this is not fully developed until really you reach into your 20s. And so this whole complicated prefrontal cortex association area takes a while to mature and become fully functional. We also have a posterior association area, and this is kind of diffuse. It's kind of spread around between temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. This is more functionally related to facial recognition, our ability to recognize faces of people that we know in our family. It allows us to localize ourselves and our surroundings, where you are in relation to the world around you, and integration of sensory input into our cognitive understanding of the world. This is also kind of interesting if you have a patient who had a parietal lobe stroke. Parietal lobe is important for integrating the world around us. These patients can end up having what's called neglect, or we actually would call it Hemi Neglect, which is basically where they basically ignore half their world. So if you have a patient who had a left parietal lobe stroke, they are going to exhibit right Hemi Neglect. Okay? And so I gave you the link of a couple things. I've got a video of a dog with Hemi Neglect. So he basically eats half his bowl of food because he's not really aware of the other half of it. The other one is a patient who is being tested using what's called the clock test. And this is an assessment tool that's used to test for Hemi Neglect. And so what you have is a patient, they're given kind of a clock face, and they're asked to put the numbers on the clock face, and they will basically number, all the way around, and they will basically ignore this whole half of the clock, because this person, they don't put numbers on this half of the clock, they're going to have a left Hemi Neglect, and they put all their numbers on the right side of the clock. But take a look at that couple patient videos there. Okay, so the first thing we talked about was the cerebral cortex. That's everything we've been talking about. So all of those motor areas, multimodal association areas, all of those areas were in the cerebral cortex, located in that outer 3 millimeters or so crust of the brain. Now we're down to cerebral white matter. And again, cerebral white matter is typically called that and has that appearance because it contains myelinated nerve fibers that are bundled and are traveling to different areas in the brain. Okay, so this is how we're able to relay information within the cerebral cortex, going from area to area, as well as from the cerebral cortex traveling down the spinal cord. We have 3 different types of tracts that we can see in the cerebral white matter. We have commissural fibers, which are responsible for connecting the two hemispheres together. So they're going to go from left to right. We have association fibers that connect different parts within the same hemisphere, and then projection fibers that are going to connect the cerebral cortex, or that outer crust, to lower structures within the brain or the spinal cord. So let's look at that. Commissural fibers are going to run from left to right cerebral hemisphere. The biggest one of those is going to be corpus callosum. So that's our prime example of commissural fibers. And you're going to see them here running from right half of the, or right cerebral hemisphere over to the left side. If we look at the brain in a sagittal plane view, commissural fibers or corpus callosum is going to be located here. Okay, and we've got fibers going from one side to the next. The second type is going to be association fibers. And so association fibers are responsible for connecting different areas within the same hemisphere. So they're basically going to run either all in the right hemisphere or all in the left hemisphere. And then the third type is going to be projection fibers. And so these are bundles of axons that connect higher level areas, and they're going to travel down and either travel to lower areas of the brain or even all the way out down to the spinal cord. Right. Our third structure, we talked about cerebral cortex. We've talked about cerebral white matter. And then here's our third structure within the cerebral hemispheres, or basal ganglia. These basically are comprised of structures called caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus. These structures are responsible for receiving input from the cortex and then relaying this information through the thalamus, which we're going to talk about in just a second, to the primary motor cortex. And so they're going to play a role with motor function and the cerebral cortex. Now, on to our second region of the brain. So if you recall, I always like to kind of review things. Our first region of the brain were the cerebral hemispheres. So we were talking about all structures that were located as part of the cerebral hemispheres. Now we're on to our second region. This is the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is going to consist of a few structures that we're going to talk about. The thalamus is one, and it's indicated here in purple. It's kind of this egg-shaped structure here. It's also this structure right here. And this is basically a gateway to the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus serves as a relay station for sensation. So we have sensory information that's traveling up through the spinal cord. It's going to go to the thalamus, and then it's going to be projected to our sensory cortex, or motor activities that are actually doing exactly the opposite. And they're going to travel down and be relayed through the thalamus and down to the body. Epithalamus is another structure that's involved or located within the diencephalon. And we can see the epithalamus. It's located here. And one of the structures that is important or contained within the epithalamus is the pineal gland. Okay, so this is going to contain the pineal gland. Pineal gland is important because it secretes the hormone melatonin, which helps us to regulate our sleep-wake cycles. We have increased secretion of melatonin by the pineal gland when it gets dark at night to tell your body that it's time to sleep. So it basically plays a role in maintaining your circadian rhythm. Okay, another structure that's located within the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. So hypo means below, right? So this is going to be a structure that's below the thalamus. So just on this image here, here's thalamus. It's this kind of oval egg-shaped area. This structure here below it is going to be the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is important. It controls a lot of different functions in the body. It's our main visceral control center. It controls the autonomic nervous system. So it has a role in all of these functions. It's basically the boss of the endocrine system. It manipulates or maintains our body temperature, thirst, sleep-wake cycles, fear, rage, sex drive. It basically has a role in everything. It contains a couple structures. One is going to be the mammillary bodies. So if you look on this, I'm trying to see my little tiny, let me get rid of this one here. There we go. Okay. So mammillary bodies are going to be these two tiny little kind of bulb-shaped structures that are located in the hypothalamus. And mammillary bodies are a site that relay olfactory information. So olfactory is smell. So we have olfactory information that's coming from the nose. It's going to travel to the mammillary bodies and then relay that information to the olfactory cortex in the temporal lobe. We also have the pituitary gland that is located kind of hanging off the bottom of the hypothalamus. So this is pituitary gland here, this is hypothalamus here, and then pituitary gland would be hanging off the infundibulum, which is basically kind of the stalk that hangs down, and we've got pituitary gland, anterior and posterior pituitary gland. Pituitary gland plays a major role with endocrine function, secreting hormones to control a lot of different processes in the body. And I kind of asked this question here, where in the skull is the pituitary gland located? And it's located in this little saddle-like structure in the base of the skull. It's called the sella turcica. Oops. Apparently can't write and talk at the same time. Sella turcica. Okay, in the